to everyone who has given up their evening to join us. I'm Claire Hetzel, the CEO at Landcare Victoria, and we have some great expertise tonight to be able to share the first of our carbon farming outreach webinars that we'll be delivering as part of a partnership with Agriculture Victoria and the 10 Catchment Management Authorities. So this program is working to assist Victorian farmers to understand their emissions and the benefits of carbon farming. It's the first program of its kind, and together we're working to deliver more than 130 tailored training events to the needs of local audiences across the state. So we're pretty excited that these local events have begun rolling out, and we're celebrating with tonight's webinar, and we've brought together Nicholson and Ag Vic experts Graeme and Anja to help answer your emission and carbon questions. So before we go on, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm meeting tonight, and that's the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I would like to acknowledge that Landcare Victoria is inspired by the legacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as this land's first custodian. So just a few housekeeping items. This is a webinar rather than a Zoom meeting, which I imagine most people are familiar with, but there's there's a Q&A function which you'll be able to use to put your questions in. We've got our support team here, which is Tani Burgess, our carbon farming outreach coordinator, who will be helping to answer those questions as we go along. And we'll also pick up at the end some opportunities for a bit of a verbal response from the experts who are joining us here tonight. If you like some of the questions that you see, you can give them a thumbs up, and ultimately that starts to vote them to the top of the list so that we can answer them in real time with you tonight. So I would like to introduce Graeme. And so Graeme Anderson is a climate specialist at Agriculture Victoria and is a science communicator and extension leader within the Victoria's agricultural sector. He leads a small team who delivers climate change services. And he will speak tonight from Ag Vic to help you understand the big picture of carbon farming. He has 35-year background in science and policy communication, practice change and adoption, farm planning, catchment salinity, revegetation, you name it. So with that, Graeme, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks, Tani and Cam, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. We've got a lot to get through. I'm helping to set the scene before I hand over to Cam, just about making sense of carbon farming. What is it? We're hearing a lot more about it. We're sort of leading our team, and we're currently doing things like the on-farm emissions pilot. So there's lots of great questions. There's no silly questions when it comes to this topic. So I will just set the scene. One thing we'd just like to say too, that this is not a new issue. The background is all around climate related, and you're hearing about changes in climate change, but it's all to do with the fact that greenhouse gases trap heat. The more we put in the atmosphere, the hotter our future becomes, and basically there's a reckoning. This discussion's been talked about a lot for the last 3 decades, but we're at a really important time in history now where what we do in the next 2 or 3 decades will determine where we end up. And so you can see on the right there that CO2 in parts per million is being added to the atmosphere. And the big challenge at the minute is can we basically stop adding extra emissions by about 2050? So that's what the whole net zero carbon neutral concept is over the 3 decades ahead. And the choice is, if we do our best, we'll still have climate change and a lot extra heat and extreme weather. But if we don't, the extremes will be a lot worse. And to just look at the recent climate change modelling for Victoria by the CSIRO in 2019, they were looking at that. And a high emissions future would mean in 30 years' time we'd have 50-degree days in heat waves in Victoria in only the 2050s. So we've got a lot at stake in agriculture to try and actually get emissions down in the next decade or two. So I guess there's a lot of activity that's happening, and this is still all about how the economy grows, but in ways that reduce emissions. So every sector is required to do their bit. We're seeing a lot of activity at international levels. There's international agreements, there's national commitments, there's state corporate business targets as well. And so there's a lot of that's been really ramping up. And basically, you can sort of see here, all sectors are required to do their bit. There's a lot going on, as we know, in the energy sector. Basically, there's a challenge there for currently high emitters, big challenges ahead, but also there's huge opportunity for those businesses and folks that can find ways to provide the things that society needs. And in pharma, we're talking about growing food and fibre, doing that in ways that has less emissions than it took last year, finding ways to reduce those emissions from producing the things that society wants is a huge opportunity. So that's the big challenge that we've got in front of us. And while we don't have to get there overnight, there's already lots of opportunities there for folks looking for lower emissions food and fibre. And just an example of that, when we look into supply chain responses, and this is information that we've got from Professor Richard Eckard, who some of you may know from Melbourne University, but in agriculture and in food supply chains and our agricultural exports, because we do export a lot of food and fibre from Australia, a lot of the supply chains we sell into all have pretty strong and ambitious emissions and carbon reduction targets, and you can see some of those companies that are listed there. This includes supply chains, processes, banks, and places where we export to. So at some point, what happens with a lot of these commitments is they're reducing their own emissions. They have quite ambitious targets, but then they start to look upstream to their suppliers saying, well, we're looking to seek from lower emissions. Now, Victoria's got a great advantage because we're pretty advanced and clean and green producers. So we're just looking at how do we keep improving that to maintain our status. And I guess one thing when we look at carbon and farming, basically everyone that's involved in farming is basically carbon farmers, because farms turn over a huge amount of carbon each year. And as you know, we start the season, we get the autumn break, we get rainfall, and we use photosynthesis to turn rain and soil nutrition into plant growth, produce a lot of carbon, but often a lot of carbon is in and out of the system each year. Like we grow a lot of carbon, it's shipped off as grain or food or meat or wool. But within a few years, that's back in the atmosphere. So a lot of this discussion about carbon farming is around how we balance, on the right-hand side, annual emissions that comes from farmers, and all businesses have emissions. And in agriculture, the most common emissions that are associated with what we do is methane from ruminant livestock and manure, nitrous oxide, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas, and ozone depleter, and carbon emissions via our fossil fuel use. So we've got that. But on the left-hand side of the equation, agriculture and farmers have something that most businesses don't have. We've got actually land, which we can use to, and it already holds a lot of carbon in our soils and in our vegetation. But also there's a lot that could be done through good old-fashioned land care, which farmers have done already, which adds more carbon into our landscape. And so a lot of farms are looking at how we balance the two. How can we work on one side to reduce the emissions over time? And also how can we look at opportunities to put more carbon into the landscape and into our farms for better shade, shelter and everything else, which we'll get into with Cam's talk too. We've been doing a lot of on-farm emissions audits with farmers, 250 farmers across the state, and we'll hear from some of them over some of the CFOP events next year. But basically, a lot of farmers are just looking at how do we balance the outgoings, which is the emissions, and you can see there a bit of an infographic on the left here with the livestock associated emissions, the nitrous oxide, our energy and fossil fuel emissions, but there can be balanced or inset by what annual sort of carbon we're absorbing through our trees or perhaps through our soils. And so So that's sort of helping us get a bit of an idea of the comings and goings of a farm. And there's different calculators and tools that are available. We use the Uni of Melbourne GAF tools, Greenhouse Accounting Framework tools, but there's a lot of tools available to do this. But often people are interested in just knowing one element of that. We think it's useful to try and just see it all in perspective so you can then map out a bit of a plan of attack. Well, what do we do in the years ahead? The other thing I guess we'll probably hear more about, talking about scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. There's a lot of jargon in this language, but scope 1 and 2 emissions is basically the emissions associated with our own business. So scope 1 is the emissions from our own business and from our farms. Scope 2 is just basically counting the emissions associated with our own energy use from our business. But there's this term called scope 3, which is where, from a farm point of view, it just means it's the emissions associated with our upstream purchases and production. And so that's pretty important. We're looking at that. And for example, you could be purchasing fertilizer, and depending on where you get it from, one source of fertilizer might have twice the emissions associated with its manufacture than another. So over time, more people are looking upstream and asking those questions about, well, is there a difference between higher emissions or lower emissions for the same product? And I guess a question that will be all sort of possibly being asked in the coming few years is, as the food and fibre supply chain starts doing their scope 3 emissions and they start asking upwards up the supply chain about how much emissions are from the products they buy, that's where we'll be starting to be getting asked on farms. So pretty significant, and it's already happening. And part of it's just about how we get better at providing that data and demonstrating that we're doing a good job. But also, every 5 years we can look back and say, you know what, we're still growing more food and fibre with less emissions by adding new innovation. So that's largely what it's all about: reducing emissions and then adding more carbon where we can. So there's lots already happening. There's a lot of decisions already being made, and there's quite a lot of businesses that are actively seeking lower emissions producers. So there's a lot of upside for us being pretty efficient producers in Victoria. It's not something we have to do overnight. There's a lot of data and tools and things that are available. And so there's plenty of support through the Carbon Farming Outreach Program to help everyone make sense of this in the coming year. Really, from farmers, no one's forced to do anything. You just adopt solutions and good ideas when they make sense to do so on your farm. It's all about efficient farming, saving money where it makes sense, and healthier landscapes. Now, we're already doing pretty well, but there's also an expectation we can keep improving, and agriculture normally does. We look back every decade and we've always improved how we do things. But also, as you say, don't try and solve this all alone. Team up with others. We've all got to play a part, and that's one of the great things about the CFOP events that are being planned by the wider team. There's going to be lots of events where you can talk this through with your colleagues and work out what's working and what's not. So thanks for joining. Hopefully that's a quick scene setter, and to make really good sense of it. There's lots of resources that will be available through the program. We've got making sense of carbon emissions on farm booklets and things on our website, but there's lots of resources coming through the CFOP program. And to jump into the farm level, I'll hand over to Cam.
A big thank you, Graeme. And I have to say, every time I hear a little presentation on carbon farming, I learn a little bit more. So I do want to introduce Cam. And Cam, if you want to get your slides up ready to go while I do so, please feel free. So I guess, Cam, it's a real pleasure to have you on board. I have to say I've met your partner, Fiona, and ultimately you guys have been doing something in the carbon space for a very long time. So Cam is an agronomist, and he's been consulting in the ag industry for more than 40 years and is a director of a consulting business called Nicholson Rural Services. So he's doing this in practice. When we talk about starting to measure things, I'm not sure I've met someone who's got more data and more pleasure in taking data than you guys. But ultimately, I will hand over to you so that you can talk us through some of the things that you've learned over time and what this kind of means practically for people who are trying to wrap their heads around carbon and on-farm emissions.
All right, thank you, Claire, and thanks for the invite. I'm going to focus very much on what we've decided to do on our farm. So a little bit of background, Fiona and I farm on the Victorian Peninsula. So the top right-hand photo is a bit of the farm, the southern bit of the farm, heading down towards, that's first of all Swan Bay, and just behind that's Port Phillip Bay. So we're in a lovely part of the world. We run beef cattle and sheep, so they're both self-replacing. We're heavily involved with a group called Tammany or Angus as part of that, and we turn off steers for the long-fed Japanese market, so they get sold at about 13 to 15 months old, and they go up to Queensland or northern New South Wales for about 270 days, and then sold in the Japanese market. And we have fine wool merino sheep as well that are self-replacing. I got involved in the carbon space in about 2011, 2012. I was lucky enough to be part of a group of ag consultants in the first carbon farming outreach program. When this whole thing was kicking off, the Australian government was starting to create these things called Australian carbon credit units, and they were creating methods and things like that to be able to get credits for carbon projects. And I was skilled up in that the area of carbon, and was very interested and thought I should apply this to my farm, so that both Fiona and I could understand what was going on, but secondly, so I could advise individual clients that I was working with about where I saw this carbon space going. So we've been doing this, as Claire said, for more than a decade, but we're very good on record keeping. Fiona keeps describing us as a data-driven farm. We collect a lot of information and have for the last 30-odd years that we've been farming. And so that put us in a good position to almost backdate some of the stuff from 2011. So that's the sort of information I'll share as I go through the slides. So a little bit of background, I got involved in this. Fiona's dad had a couple of 100 acres on the peninsula. We subsequently worked in partnership with him from 1993 when we got married. And then we've bought blocks subsequent to that and expanded the farm. Fiona and I had a tree planting business that we used to run on the Victorian Peninsula, so we'd plant trees for other people. This was actually before we were married. So all the trees that you see in the background going down here, which is our farm, we've planted over the 30-odd year period. And then the farm comes back to the bottom of your screen as well. So we've been expanding over time. As I said, we've done a lot of land class fencing, so very much the early land care days of land class fencing. So water courses, there's a water course that runs through the middle of the property there. That's all been fenced off. Our major water supplies are fenced off as well. We've got different pasture species for different soil types across the farm. We do a lot of monitoring of soil conditions, soil testing. Every paddock is tested on the farm every 3 years and has for the last 30-odd years. And we've got about 40 paddocks on the farm now. So we've got a very good record of that. And I use that intensely to modify both fertiliser application and also things like lime and gypsum. Fully reticulated water supply. We haven't actually dug a dam ourselves except for expanded some of the big ones we've fenced off. And that's reticulated through solar pumps to the tanks that you can see in the bottom here that reticulate to the whole farm. We use what I'll call grazing and rest rather than rotational grazing. We understand the principles of how pastures grow, and so at various times we will spell them longer than we need to or graze them harder than we need to get the outcome that we want from a pasture point of view. And we've planted about 10% of the farm's trees now. So we're closing in on about 40,000 trees across the place we've planted. And started the first of those in 1980. Fiona's dad started those, and we ramped it up in 93, and I'll show you a bit around that. And I mentioned the data collection. We're a bit of nuts on that, but we find it very useful to have. I want to just talk a little bit, and Graeme set the scene beautifully, so I'm going to use the same infographic, I think he described it, of how we've been tracking our emissions and sequestration and how this story sort of builds up. So we were fortunate that we had enough data that I could go back and start to calculate our emissions even before 2011, and we've been tracking those emissions ever since. And so this is what Graeme referred to as his scope 1 and scope 2, or inside your farm boundary type emissions. And that's what it looks like on for our farm over the, what's that, about a 15, 16-year period. So over that period, our total emissions have gone up from around about that 900 tonne sort of mark to about 1,200 as we've expanded the business. So as we bought more land or leased some land next door and expanded in that, our total farm emissions have gone up, which is understandable. You make the business bigger, you're likely to have greater emissions as a result of that. So if you like, the bigger the business, in a sense, the harder the challenge, because you've got more emissions to have to deal with in those bigger sort of size properties. But we also had some data that we could estimate our tree sequestration. So if you think of that infographic that Graeme had, and he had the trees and the soils, we could do stuff around the trees. And so we used an approach or a method, and I should have said those calculations that we did on our emissions each year, those historic ones, we used what Graeme referred to as the GAF tool, the Greenhouse Accounting Framework tool. So, and I'd really encourage people to use that type of a tool because it meets the national greenhouse gas standards for the country. So it's calculated the same way as the Australian government would calculate it, and is very similar to what's needed if you ever wanted to create carbon credits through a carbon project. For the tree one, we use the method that the Australian government uses for any vegetation type thing for creating ACCUs or carbon credits. And so we've got 38, I think it's 38 plantations across the farm now, 37 plantations across the farm, as you can see there, and use a model called FullCam. So it's a computer model that estimates for the tree type or type of planting that you've put in for our location with the soil type and with the climate, what the expectation is as far as tree growth goes. So what I've just shown here on the graph is from 1980 to 2070. So that seems a long way away, but we've used a carbon model on that, and how much carbon is being captured each year in carbon dioxide equivalents from all of those different plantations, recognising that those plantations have been planted at different times. So some are older than others, and also recognising that they have a different mix of species in them. Some very strongly environmental type planting, so very high diversity of species, to other plantations that have a higher proportion of eucalypts in them, to some that we've got as woodlots, which is just single species for that as well. So what you notice about this is because we started planting very early on in the piece, our peak capture of carbon at about 650 tonnes per hectare, CO2 equivalents per year, we've already passed that. So unfortunately, because we got in early and we did a lot of plantings early, we're still capturing carbon, but it's on a decreasing plane. And that's because as those trees mature, they just don't capture as much carbon as when they were rapidly growing in the early stages. So of the trees that we've planted, we're on this downward slide. So each year they're still capturing carbon, and a significant amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. So that was the carbon farming that Graeme was talking about. But it's just going to be at a diminishing rate. So it's important for us to recognise that the trees aren't going to solve our problem in the long run unless we start planting more trees, or we chop some of these down and replant them again. So they have, if you like, a saturation of how far we can get. What's been interesting, and I'll mention this a little bit more in the future, is that this FullCam model has just been updated. So it's a test version at the moment. And when we've run the same trees in the new model, where there's been more research done and understanding of that, we're getting about a 20 to 25% greater credit out of the model than what we did out of these older versions. So if you add another 25% onto that, that 700 could well be around 1,000. We may have peaked at 1,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. And if I quickly flick back to this one, that's 1,000 there. So it's pretty close to where our emissions might be. We've also had a bit of a crack at the soil. I mentioned that we do a lot of soil measurement. Now, unfortunately, the soil measurement was only 0 to 10 centimetres that we've been doing, and it was an agronomic soil test. So it was really about making the pastures grow and what the pastures needed. To do proper carbon accounting, you need to use a different method and some other additional tests as well. But I'll show you this first lot, which is from the 0 to 10 centimetres that we've tracked over the years. And it's interesting, when I went back to really early soil tests, organic carbon wasn't even measured on the test. It was an optional one that you had to do. So we did a lot of testing where we had no organic carbon numbers. But anyway, we've got some now. I'll just show you a bundle. This is just 9 paddocks, so it's 116 hectares. It's got 153 soil tests that make up this bit of data information I'll show you. And we started measuring that in 1995. For anybody that understands some of the nutrient sort of levels on that, the fertility is really good. So phosphorus levels really high, potassium high, sulfur high. So there's no constraints there from an agronomic point of view. And the pH, we've had 2 rounds of liming as well. So there's the pH is pretty good on that as well. And if you actually look at this now, it's a bit of a busy graph, but if you just bear with us, I'll explain it. Along the bottom here is the year since our first soil test that we did for these 9 paddocks. This is the measured organic carbon up to 0 to 10 centimetres. The blue dots represent when we've done these 9 paddocks together, 116 soil tests, and it's averaged out as the organic carbon as a percentage per hectare. So in other words, if we had one paddock that was only 1 hectare and it was 3%, and we had a 10 hectare paddock that was 2%, we wouldn't say the average is 2.5. It'd be much lower than that because we've got 10 hectares of 2% and only 1 hectare of 3%. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So it's sort of an average of where those paddocks are across 116 hectares on a per hectare basis. And the first thing I think to pick up is just how much it bounces around. These are paddocks that basically have been treated the same, grazed the same, and have the same species in them, and essentially are the same soil type or soil texture. But we just have this really big variation, even over a couple of years, between where our soil carbon sits. If you put a line through that, line of best fit through that, as I said, I'm a bit of a nerd on this sort of stuff, we've had more rapid growth when it's accumulation when it's down here, but it's starting to sort of taper off as we start to get 25, 30 years in. And I'll explain a bit more why that's the case when you look at how soil carbon sort of accumulates. What's interesting though is when we track things like the amount of rainfall we get and therefore how much we can grow over a period, how it seems to track with where these blue dots are going, even though they're bouncing around a lot. So GSR refers to growing season rainfall. And so a growing season rainfall of a 9 means that it's in the best 10% of years or 90% of the highest rainfall we've ever had. So these are really good growing years. So we've had a period here, apart from that first year, these last 3 years have been well above average or average growth. And over that period, when we've grown a whole lot more pasture, our soil carbons have shown up as increasing as a result of it because we've grown more stuff. And same in this period here, it's jumped up because we had a good period of growing conditions. And you can probably guess now, this one going down here, when you look at those growing conditions, that's when we went through a drought period with growing season rainfall of 2 and 1. So worst 10% of years, worst 20% of years. So a very dry period when we didn't grow much feed and the soil carbon depleted as a result. So what Graeme was saying about how this soil carbon can go up and down, this is exactly what we're seeing in real life with these numbers. So the variability is something that we really need to take into account. The other thing, because I've got an agronomic background and a soils background, is I was able to run some computer models for our soil type and our location. The green line represents what the computer models are suggesting the maximum amount of organic carbon that soil can hold. So the message to take out of this is we're pretty close to what you might call the upper limit of it. And because we've had this data and we understand where that upper limit is, that's given us a really good picture of what opportunity or lack of opportunity, another way of thinking about it, that we've got in capturing carbon in the soil. It's highly variable and we're pretty close to the top anyway, as far as that goes. So being able to do all of that, if you put those pieces together with that historic information I've got, so this stuff here of what we're emitting and these stuff here of what we're sequestering, we get a long-term picture like this. This is our tree carbon sequestration. Remembering when I showed you the trees, we went out to 2070, and this is only going to 2024. So that's our carbon sequestration with the trees. That's what it is if you model the carbon. And the reason why we've got spikes in this is because as we were picking up new blocks, and they were low in carbon, we would get a rapid gain in that organic carbon very quickly. They were cropping paddocks that had low carbon. After 10, 15 years of continuous cropping, when we put them back into long-term pasture and manage them and graze them well, we get a rapid increase in that soil carbon early on, and then it starts to taper off as we get closer towards that sort of saturation area. And if we put our emissions across that, which was the first graph I showed you, that's what it looks like. So we're almost carbon neutral in some years. We think we probably are and have been for a few years. And then sometimes we're not, just depending on where we're sitting. So this idea of carbon neutrality is something that we've really been trying to grapple of how we might achieve that in the long run. The other thing just to keep in mind is that in doing these calculations, the 3 greenhouse gases are assigned what's called a global warming potential. And you use that to multiply methane and nitrous oxide up to making an equivalent of what it would be if it was carbon dioxide. And that's what this term over here, carbon dioxide equivalent, means. The challenge we've had is since I've been doing this, the carbon dioxide measures for methane, GWP 100 measures for methane and nitrous oxide have changed 4 times. And just to give you an example, when we first started putting this together, the global warming potential for methane was 21, and because we've got largely a livestock business is where most of our emissions come from, that's what our first graph looked like. And then with new science that was coming on, they changed that global warming potential for methane from 21 to 24, and currently is 28, and is soon to go back to 27. That's what 28 looks like. So in this one here, we were feeling quite smug about ourselves, thinking we were capturing more carbon than we were emitting. But as the rules have changed, then we've found that we've had a change in where our position sits. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that as the science evolves, these things change and your emission calculations will change, which took us a little while to get our heads around because we thought that was very unfair, but we understand why it's happening now because of the new research that's being done. So we've moved to something else now. So instead of looking at this as what's our total carbon capture and what's our total emissions, we've moved to something different called emissions intensity. And the reason why we've moved down that path is, one, as Graeme suggested, that the supply chain is now having a greater influence over setting signals for individual producers. And secondly, the Food and Ag Organisation, so the FAO, which is part of the United Nations, which is part of all this climate stuff as well, when they've looked at the livestock systems around the world, they talk in terms of emissions intensity as much, if not more so, than low or zero emission from the agricultural industries. So in a sense, we've changed what we focus on. And this came to bear, and this was only last week. Most people probably won't know who Dr. Q is, but he's the Director General of the FAO. Graeme was out with us. This was our farm last week. And we would have spoken for an hour and a half about the importance of emissions and emissions intensity measurements and trying to lower those for livestock. And this is a global thing that we were talking about. It was a fascinating discussion. So he's the head of Food and Ag around the world, which influences a whole lot of this climate stuff. And he was very much on the basis that emissions intensity is what we should be focusing on, because emissions intensity refers to the amount of emissions for a amount of product you produce. So it's an efficiency measure. It's a bit like an efficiency measure of fuel efficiency in a car. We're trying to find the ones that have got the most fuel efficient cars. They're the ones we should be driving. No different in a farming business. We're trying to find people that can produce protein, in this case for the FAO, or kilograms of livestock, or litres of milk, or milk solids, or tons of grain, or whatever else, the most efficiently for the amount of emissions they're putting out. And this has really changed in the last few years, our focus and our thinking around this. So where we've come to at this point in time is, our emissions have been increasing slightly because we've expanded the business. We've passed our peak carbon sequestration capture in trees. And that's just something that we've had to wear. We're a bit disappointed with that when we did all the modelling, but that's where we're at. We've realised that accurately measuring soil carbon is really difficult. I've just stuck this graph up here now. I said we were doing 0 to 10 centimetre measurements. We've now gone down to a metre. So we did the sampling exactly the same way if we wanted to create soil carbon measurements. So just to explain this is our organic carbon going across the top. And if you can imagine, this is going into the soil. So this is getting deeper into the soil. So we took samples and measured them at 4 depths, and we took 27 samples across the farm at that 0 to 10 centimetres, 27 samples at 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. And these bars going across represent the variability in it. And so what we realised is just how variable our soils were, not only in the organic carbon, but 2 other tests you've got to do, which is what's called bulk density of the soil, and also the amount of gravel that soil's got in it. So the variability worried us, because if we were committing to something, we may be lucky enough to snag a positive change over time, but we could just as easily, through the measurement, snag a negative change over time. And we've sold carbon or promised carbon to someone which now no longer exists. And we would be in strife then about how we manage that going forward. So we've sort of taken that off as well. And combined with that, we've got a small gap, I call it, between the current and attainable soil carbon. So if you like, our emissions have gone up, but our sequestration, soils we've sort of put on the back burner a bit, and our tree one, we just have to accept that that's reduced over time. And will continue to reduce more and more because of the age of those plantings. And so we've really concluded that carbon neutrality as it is going to be impossible without some new technologies. Okay, what we've got at the moment, we reckon we've been applying as much as we can, but there's some exciting new technologies that are coming onto the scene. But more importantly, and it came from the FAO down, but there's a lot of messages out there now, agriculture doesn't have to be carbon neutral. It just has to be much lower emissions than where we're sitting at the moment. Okay, so that gives us a much better sense of what that target should be that we should be aiming for. And so our focus now is on lowering livestock emissions intensity using existing stuff we've got and new technology. So, and the last thing I just said, the goalposts keep shifting. And so be pretty careful what you claim. I hear a number of people that want to claim carbon neutrality, but as these things change, and the calculators change because new research is showing us different things that can change as well. And this was just this example of these 3 different greenhouse gases that we're worried about and what their global warming potential over 100 years is. And you could see that one for methane. It's gone from 21 to 25 to 28, which is what we're using at the moment. And as soon as it gets adopted, or relatively soon, it'll get adopted, and the calculator will drop our emissions slightly because we'll use 27 as part of that. So goalposts keep shifting. Just be prepared that it's going to be roughly right, but precisely wrong, because as we learn new stuff, things are going to get better. So where do we see the future? We think a lot of this is going to be driven by the supply chain. And Graeme mentioned this one as well. The bit I don't think he emphasised as much, and the one that's really caught our attention, is that because of the products we supply raw wool that goes into processing, we supply meat, and we supply, in particular, steers that then go into a feedlot. That's the feedlot, and they're really interested on how efficiently people are providing steers to them that we're selling. And in fact, it was a couple of years ago, we had a Zoom meeting with all of the suppliers for this feedlot, and they were saying, does anybody know their carbon emissions number? Because it's going on our ledger when we sell the product at the end of the Japanese, we actually need to know what the emission numbers are, and you can see, and you can sort of extrapolate over time, they're going to look to pick suppliers who are lower emissions for similar products, because they just have less emissions they then need to offset if they want to claim a carbon neutral product at the other end. So this, when it came into focus 3 or 4 years ago, really changed our attention to say, we're a scope 3 supplier to people down the supply chain, we've really got to get our act into gear, and we've really got to understand what that number is and keep driving that lower so we can still be in a position so various people in the supply chain will want to buy from us. Okay, and Graeme's already put this one up, but I reckon it's really sobering. The 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are companies and 31 are countries. Government policy may now be less influential than market forces. I think it will be the supply chain and the people buying our products in the commercial world that are going to drive this emission stuff more so than what government targets are. The fundamental thing in all of this is you need to understand what's going on here. And just to give you an example of that, this is our emissions for the beef side of the operation. So I showed you one before, which was the beef and sheep side. This is just the beef bit of it, emissions over that same time period. This is what our production has been over the last 15 years. We've gone from producing about 60,000 kilos of live weight to about 80,000 kilos of live weight over that period. So we've increased our productivity by 25%. But if I flick back to the other graph, basically our emissions around our beef side of the operation have stayed the same. So we've expanded the sheep side and kept the beef side the same. If you look at emissions intensity, which is just the amount of carbon dioxide we produce, which is that graph there, divided by this line here, you get this graph here, which is our emissions intensity graph. And this is the one that the supply chain's interested in at the moment. And so our emissions intensity has gone down to this level here. And just to put into perspective what that means, that's typically where beef production is around the country. The Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, which is a national framework for the beef industry, says that the average should be around about 13.1 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every kilogram of live weight that we turn off in the beef industry. So that's what that dot there represents. And then there are companies like Graeme that offer a premium or a price incentive if you can reach what's called their tier 3 standard. And for the carbon bit of their sustainability standard, it's 9.2 kilos of CO2. And we've been running at about 9 for the last 4 or 5 years. So what excites me about this is, one, we're getting some pretty clear signals now from some industry sectors. And secondly, that we can do it with the tools we've currently got available. We're not waiting for some new whiz-bang technology to save us. What's being set at the moment in the supply chain, we've got to work hard at it, but we can actually get there and potentially achieve that. And so that's the emissions intensity story. That's where our beef sits about 9. Our wool stuff and our sheep meat stuff compared to industry standards isn't as flash. But we're just starting to focus on that over the last couple of years because we'd focused on the beef one before. So take-home message from our farm perspective is that we can do this, but you've got to be pretty good on your game to be able to get there. You don't know these numbers at all unless you start doing your emissions calculations. It's just a fundamental thing. None of these numbers include any of the sequestration that I spoke about before. This is purely just on the emissions for the amount of product that we can produce over time. And to put that in perspective, this is all about carbon, but I don't know how many people are familiar with the Australian Sustainability Framework. Emissions reduction is just one part of what is going to be a much bigger picture that we as farmers are going to have to face going forward as far as our recording goes. And so while I mentioned the trees, and we think we've probably done our dash on the trees with their maximum carbon capture, they are going to be incredibly important, and the soil stuff is going to be incredibly important in this part of the equation. So we're thinking beyond carbon, and we're thinking more about this has got a whole lot of potential now. Older trees have got far more potential from a biodiversity landscape point of view than young trees have. And just an example, Fiona took a photo a couple of days ago. We've got a sea eagle that's now making a nest in a tree that we planted 30 years ago. It is the most exciting thing to see. It's about 50 metres up in the air, but it is just an amazing thing to see happen. And they were trees that got planted on a landscape that there wasn't a tree there before. So, our trees, from all the benefits we've got from shade, shelter, the environmental stuff and the birds that have come back, it doesn't owe us anything from a carbon point of view. So we're not overly upset because we think we've got some other benefits from that as well. And just to finish off, a couple of things. The data collection is super important. If anybody wants to do this and do this well, you do need data, you do need good evidence. And when you understand the calculators and what they need, that's what we should focus on. And for the last few years, we've paid a lot of attention to trying to develop systems that make that really easy to collect that data or collect that evidence, because further down the track, the supply chain will want that evidence. You can't just claim it with no backing behind it. So we've very much switched our attention to how do we collect this data. So some of the software packages that we've got at the moment, we've made customized reports that help us do that calculation. We've created some of our own simple tools for that collation purpose, particularly things like herbicides and fuel and all that sort of stuff. We transfer a lot of that information every time we do our BAS reporting, because what you need in the calculator, you're handling it in your BAS reporting. So we just have the two open together. And when I do the BAS reporting, I just transfer those bits of information across, which makes that data collection really easy. And we've gone pretty hard on the new technology. And a couple of things we've got up there, we use Mobile, because one of the things in a livestock calculation, you need to know the number of animals you've got, what their sex is, and what their age class is. And so we use this as a simple tool. It's on your phone. And we use that to move mobs around, so we know exactly how many animals we've got at any point in time, and we just transfer that back from the calculator. We've spent a bit of money, partly because we're getting old, in both handling for our sheep and cattle, but also we've now got all the scales set up so it automatically weighs every time an animal goes through, because weights are another important thing that you need as part of your understanding to do an accurate calculation. We used to run stock through the yards a lot of times. We just never bothered turning the scales on. Now we've learned, we might as well turn the scales on, collect that data because it helps. And if anybody's got one of these down the bottom here, an OptiWeigh, these are the most amazing bits of gear. You get daily weight gain on animals. You leave it out in the paddock, they step on it, they collect their weights accurately. And you get a sort of printout like this of what their weight gain's been in the last 14 days, 30 days, 90 days, which animals have been measured and so on. We have used this now to change our grazing management, because we know as soon as our high value animals that we want to grow quickly start dropping off in their growth rates, they get moved. Where previously they would have stayed in there for a few days. That allowed us this year to turn a mob of steers off, 40 odd steers off 6 weeks earlier. For the weight into the feedlot, we got a 50-cent premium of that because we were supplying earlier than we would have otherwise. And we've got exactly the numbers we needed for our calculation. But more importantly, they're 6 weeks less that they've been on our farm. And so our emissions intensity is being driven down by those sort of data collection things that A, have paid for profitably, and also from a productivity point of view. And as a co-benefit of that, it's reduced our emissions intensity and started to bring that number down even lower and lower. And if you're thinking about doing this, you'll hear a lot of people say, just go to a workshop and do your numbers. I'll tell you what, you won't have the numbers. You'll frustrate the hell out of yourself trying to go backwards with the numbers. So my suggestion for anybody is if you ever go to one of these workshops, don't worry about historic stuff. Just know what you need to start from today and do, and then move forward on that. And that would be the best way, I think, of approaching it. So they're the tools. We've used the greenhouse accounting frameworks. They're a bit clumsy because they're Excel one. One I'd just give you a heads up on is this one here. Been doing a bit of work with this group. This is Agricultural Innovation Australia. They have an online platform now, which, while we're still ironing a few bugs out of that, I think will be the way to go. You can create your own platform on that, own login, your own platform. You can put your numbers in on a regular basis. If any of the rules that I mentioned before, like the numbers for the global warming potential change, it will automatically change and backdate all your information. So it's a live version going forward. It's intended to be set up in a way that you can have an independent auditor come and look at your numbers And if you get ticked off on that, then it will generate certificates, which would allow you then to go to supply chain and say, these have been independently verified, that these are the emissions intensity associated with the product I'm selling. And it also has the provision built into it, even though it's not there yet, to be able to overlay some of the biodiversity and nature type stuff in the future. So it'll allow us to stack those things together. So I think this is a really exciting development for the future. So having a play with that with the team at AIA at the moment to develop that a bit further. And just finally, what do we see as reducing our practices? I won't go through these in a lot of detail, but this is when I was trying to get my head around, or Fiona and I, our heads around, what are the technologies or the things that potentially we could think of doing. And so I've split this up and said, there are things we can do to manipulate the farm, the way our farm operates as a system to try and reduce emissions. And then we can manipulate individual animals. You know, what are the options of manipulating individual animals where the other one's manipulating the farm? And so it's around the enterprise mix and the sort of operations that you've got, the feed that you grow, the genetics that you've got for the animals. Their reproductive performance has been huge for us. Fiona's done a fabulous job of upping that reproductive performance, which means we get more product, if you like, turned off for the same amount or similar amount of emissions. Having animals that don't get pregnant and sheep that don't have singles, you know, we can turn into twins, makes a huge difference to that emissions intensity side of it. And we're also then following on some of these other things that are going to come on the market relatively soon. Like there's some good plant breeding that's going on, and we do know that some species out there like chicory and plantain, vetch, have actually methane lowering properties. The only problem is that we could put them in today, but the calculators can't recognise us adopting those technologies. So there's some technologies that the calculator at the moment can't accommodate in these new technologies that are coming through. But that'll just be a matter of time. So, you know, if we adopted them, they would cost us money, but it doesn't change our number at the end of the day. So it's hard to reflect that. And that's something we need to balance up of when do we pull the trigger to spend money on something else. We would like to see that reflected not only in productivity improvement, but also in the calculator on the way through. And I'll just flick all over those. Tree sequestration, I mentioned to you that this new full cam accounting model that's just come out is going to be a bit more generous to us. This other one we're watching with interest around the tree side of it. One of the problems if we wanted to create carbon credits is that we have to register a project before you plant your trees. And unfortunately, we've missed the opportunity to do that. And so you feel a bit annoyed that we've got all these trees on the place that are accumulating carbon, but we can't get any recognition or credit for it. There is a draft guideline out at the moment for potentially being able to get some recognition for that. So if I go back to that diagram that I showed you before, what it would allow you to do is not get any credit for the past, but if you registered, and it's called insetting, would allow you to get a credit for those trees, even though they're diminishing, carbon credits for some of those trees going forward. There are a lot of rules around that. There's a lot of and there'll be suggested costs around that as well. They can't be sold to anybody else. They can only be used on your farm, and you've got to keep them, the trees there and all that sort of stuff. So a whole lot of rules around it. But the potential of getting recognition for old trees that we've planted, I think is pretty exciting. And we may need some of these credits in the future if the market says, we will give you a premium if your emissions intensity is below such and such, and we can't get there simply by our farm practices. We may have to use some of these credits to get there, but it's going to be a cost there, so we need to get a return on that as well. And this is one that's even more exciting. We're doing some work with this at the moment. It's a drone that flies along and actually measures, recognises the tree and then the shape of the tree and calculates the volume in those trees. We did this at our farm and home, and it was also done at Jigsaw Farm. This is with Melbourne University. They're just on the cusp of, I think, something super, super exciting. With the model that they've done here, and the direct measurement we've done here, the full cam model is underestimating the trees, which is behind this fella here, by about 4-fold. So what's physically being measured on our farm compared to what the computer model is telling us, computer model is about 2 to 4 times less than what our plantations have actually got in them. This sort of technology is going to straighten that up and be far more accurate representation. So we'd be quite comfortable to say every 5 years, fly a drone like that, see the change in our trees and get recognised for that amount of carbon that's been accumulated and stuff. So I think that will be part of this full cam model, verified by actual measurement or indirect measurement through that way, which is pretty exciting. So our future plans, just to sum up, shelve the idea of soil carbon credits. The gap just isn't quite big enough. We'll plant a few more trees, but the horse has bolted, but we'll watch that climate active and we'll watch the biodiversity space as well. You know, the change, that's a photo of when we first started. Not many trees on the place. That's the same tree stump as we've got there now. So some of these are now having some biodiversity values that are, we think, quite significant. Fiona loves the bird stuff. We have bird watchers come out from Geelong various times. We've gone from 37, I think, species when we first started, when the landscape looked like that, to about 140 now. So we've had some significant changes that we've measured over time in that space. We'll collect this, what I call the big ticket data. So we'll invest in technology to allow us to collect that information that we need, because that will help in providing the evidence to be able to verify what we're doing. And we'll concentrate on lowering emissions intensity, but not at all costs. And an example is a couple of years ago, we held on to some steers for 6 weeks longer, even though they weren't growing much more, but the price was going to be much better that we were going to be offered. So in all of this carbon stuff, we've got to balance that up against what's profitable and the right thing to do for the business, which is what Graeme had mentioned. And that's the end of my prezzo, Claire.
Wow, Cam. So I don't think I'm alone when I kind of say that was such a journey, and I want to flag that's 40 years of someone with genuine curiosity, keeping at the leading edge of things that keep changing. So if you're just starting tonight to understand this and you go, wow, Cam, I'm not going to get there tomorrow, that's okay. I really wanted to acknowledge how invested you have been in sort of a lifetime of learning and practice. So there's some really fantastic questions that are coming through, and I'm just going to shift over to this other PowerPoint here so I can get things back on track. So if you have questions that you want to ask from Cam or Graeme, and we also have Anja George here from Ag Vic, who'll be able to speak to the Carbon Farming Outreach Program as well, please do put them in the Q&A function, which looks like a little chat box down the bottom. And you can also go along and thumbs up so that we can see the ones that lots of people want to have an answer to. But there were quite a few questions here, Graeme, and Cam, and you spoke to it a little bit. But why, in terms of soil carbon, you've mentioned that the gap is small, but what would you do if you were kind of taking practices to really start to build that soil carbon? And what are some of the additional benefits that might mean you do it?
Yes, so I think of the soil carbon, I've distilled it down to be relatively simple. It's the amount of organic material or biomass you can put in compared to what biomass is being lost. You know, and Graeme mentioned that carbon gets shipped out in the products we sell, that's right. But a lot of the carbon that we put in and put into the soil gets eaten by the bugs. Okay, so the soil biology or the soil biota, carbon is their food source. So the bugs aren't making carbon, they're relying on us putting carbon into the soil. And it's through a process called mineralization, which is super important in the farming system. So mineralization is, if you think a bit of carbon that you put into the soil, plant grows, a plant root grows, let's say, or cow eats it, puts a bit of manure on the ground, there's nutrients tied up in that carbon. And when the bugs eat that carbon, they release those nutrients. So most of the nutrients that our plants use to grow from doesn't come from the fertilizer you put on, it comes from organic material breaking down. and it's the bugs that need to break that down. And their food source is new carbon that you keep putting into the system. So if you stop putting as much carbon into the system and the bugs keep eating it, they'll deplete the carbon storage that's there. And that's what we saw in those good years and bad years. So the number one thing I say to people to focus on is just grow as much stuff as you possibly can for the rainfall that you get in that period. If you get that right, now to do that, your soil conditions have got to be right. Okay, because if your soil is limiting, then you're not going to grow stuff and you're not going to be able to achieve that. But if you get your soil conditions right, and your grazing management's part of that as well, if it's in a pasture sense, you will grow as much pasture potentially as you can. Now, whether that's you put cover crops in there as well to make better use of the water and grow more total biomass, doesn't really matter. It's the amount of stuff that you can grow and grow year on year. So, and in my mind, the rest of it sort of looks after itself. We've done quite a bit of biological testing at home. We've done a whole lot of respiration stuff at home to see how active the bugs are in the soil. And we sit at a really high level for all of those. Now, the unfortunate thing is when the bugs eat that carbon, they put it back in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But in fact, what we want is a lot of carbon going in, a lot of that carbon to be broken down because that releases the nutrients. And the unfortunate byproduct of that is it's a lot of carbon being released back in the atmosphere again in that cycle. But we actually want an active soil that's leaking a whole lot of carbon. But my number one thing to everybody is just grow as much stuff as you possibly can. And a lot of the rest of it looks after itself.
Thank you, Cam. There's quite a few questions, and there's a plant nerd in me. I'm a horticulturalist who's going to kind of lift Stuart to the top here and ask, what kind of perennial grasses are you using? Are they any native C4 species, Demeter, etc.? So can you speak to some of that in terms of the diversification of that pasture species?
Yeah, so our species are what I call exotic perennials, so mainly Phalaris. Phalaris tall fescue and a little bit of ryegrass. Ryegrass in our environment's a bit touch and go. So we've gone for deep-rooted perennial grasses. And the main reason for that is in our environment, if we compare what we can grow, total carbon that we can capture and pull out of the atmosphere, with that compared to some of the native grasses, it's chalk and cheese. So if you go back to the previous comment about capture the maximum amount of stuff you can out of the atmosphere and put it in there, our perennial grasses are well-fed, well-grazed perennial grasses. Exotic perennial grasses like Phalaris and the tall fescues are the way the way we achieve that in combination with a legume as well. As you get to more marginal country, those temperate grasses may have a greater place because some of these other species just don't perform as well. But they certainly do in our environment. We can grow 17 tonne of feed in a good year on 600 mil rainfall, which is quite phenomenal if we get it at the right time.
Great, thank you, Cam. So Graeme, this question I think is for you, and I know both of you have touched on it a little bit, but can you speak to sort of the impact that drought, in particular, given some of the situations across our state, but also floods, will have in terms of an effect on our numbers?
Yeah, that's a great point, because a challenge in agriculture is, how do we try and reduce emissions, store more carbon, as well as providing profitable food fibre production. But we've got to deal with the weather. Businesses is super exposed to good old-fashioned seasonal variability, but we've also got an increase in extreme weather. We know that as the planet warms, the tropics expands each side of the equator and nudges all of our weather systems towards the poles. So for Victoria, that means if you look to your north, that warmer, dry climate is going to come and visit more often. So, every now and then, and we've just had that recently with parts of southwest Victoria having its, driest 12 months on record. Those things will just keep happening as part of climate change. So hence why we've got the dual challenge of doing that. But I think one of those really interesting things with Cam and Fiona's farm there, and great work, Cam. Like, it's so impressive, that story. It's a very complex story. There's a lot of science, but it's really good seeing it all put together. But you can see that variation in emissions and production performance, which is just impacted by seasons. And so some seasons, if we don't get the rainfall, we produce less grass, there's less animal production. So our emissions intensities usually go up. And also our soil carbon and things can often be depleted. So that's just a part of, that's one of the things we've just got to deal with. But we do know that when we look at the farms, and again, this is part of the whole history of farm planning and land care, that those farms that are really well set up, they've got good land classing, they've got really good ground cover, pasture base, they've got waterways vegetated, they've got remnant vegetation fenced. Good looking farms actually have all the key ingredients for how do we cope with that sort of variation, as well as actually increasing more carbon and as we know, all livestock systems really like shelter and shade and things. So it's sort of like, it's almost a bit old-fashioned, Claire, but good old-fashioned land care and land classing is still the way to go. And as we get more intensive rainfall events with more thunderstorm activity and extremes, having good ground cover and well vegetated farms is the best we can do. So that's all important. And Cam touched on soil health. It's such a key one. Having good quality soils that's not over compacted, that's got good ground cover, so that when we get those more intensive rains, it's that moisture's caught on the farm and helps soak into our soil, so our plants, deep-rooted plants, can use it later. That's sort of part of that, modern farming, I guess. So that's our challenge. We've got to do the two. And I guess another little cause for the caution is that if you look at longer term over climate change, most of the carbon in our landscapes, both in trees and in soils, is usually in the colder, higher rainfall environments. And so if you did a transect from southern Victoria to northern Victoria, soil carbon usually is less because it's just less annual biomass because of as you head north and it's warmer and drier. So we've got to do a pretty good job in the next 20, 30 years to maintain the carbon that's already in our landscape. And I sort of call it, we've got the task of stewardship of the existing soil carbon and carbon in our vegetation on farms and in forests, as well as how we add to it amidst, climate change. So I think that's all part of it. And again, the dual challenge of, well, we've got to still produce food and fibre, and a lot of the lessons are just in good old-fashioned land care.
Thank you, Graeme. I guess it's important to note that there are so many reasons why you would consider building and stacking intervention after intervention after intervention to be able to continue to improve ultimately the resilience of your farm and the carbon capture. And, Cam, you spoke to, and Graeme too, some of those drivers that are hitting us that might make people pay attention. But they're not all about, the supply chain or government expectations. Some of it's actually how we're going to keep creating and producing food and fibre in a pretty changeable kind of climate. There's an interesting question here, just while we're sort of talking about soil and this need to care for that, is a question about biochar, and would the production of biochar from your trees and adding enriched biochar to your soil be a valid strategy to improving the footprint of your farm? Cam or Graeme, did you have anything to add to that?
You can start, Grace, and I'll go after you.
Yeah, I guess one of the things with biochar, like with a lot of the biomass that we grow, it ends up, whether it's chewed by the bugs or animals, whatever, it ends up at some way back in the atmosphere. So biochar is one of those approaches where via basically burning in low oxygen environment, it's called pyrolysis, you can get some of that biomass, and it could be, olive chips, or it could be a waste from farm production, or it could be, chips off, off some wood chip from when you're harvesting timber and you got to convert round logs into square timber. You always have offcuts, and so that sort of thing can produce an ongoing stream of biochar, which is basically a longer form, takes that short-lived biomass and puts it into a long-term form of carbon. So there's certainly some interest in that as a longer-term thing, as well as producing energy as a byproduct. The element about how biochar adds to the soils, like if you're talking about carbon credits, the turning short-term biomass into longer-term biochar, the crediting would happen at the person who's doing the pyrolysis. So whether you would go and then use that biochar and spread it on the farm, farmers would really only probably doing that if they could see a really clear agronomic benefit, like it made their soil function a lot better, or it had a lot more fertility gain, or it stored more soil moisture, or things like that. So in sort of trials around the place, how biochar is performed, usually it really depends heavily on what's the starting condition of those soils. And so for a lot of really high functioning soils already, I know some farmers have been pretty disappointed with adding biochar and expecting something magic to happen, and nothing really happened. But in some situations where you've got something where there's something really limiting, then biochar has created that. But I think there's something there in it, but it's more to do with if there's existing waste streams in agriculture, converting some of that flow of biomass into some longer term stuff, and you're creating some renewable energy, then there's certainly room for more of that to happen. And certainly, just as we see with carbon farming, like I've got some straw panel here, which is made from excess straw, and there's a plant in Bendigo that puts this into building product, and it's an example of how carbon might be grown in the crop that year. The straw is sort of waste stubble, and it's normally put back into the soils, but some farms there's an opportunity to take some of that stubble, put it into a plant, and then that goes into buildings, and so that carbon's out of the atmosphere for perhaps another 50 years, and it's the same as timber. So they're all sort of different things where people are starting to think about, is there other ways we can get carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into something useful? So I'd clump biochar in with a whole range of other potential technologies that one day they could, but they've just got to find the right sort of fit for where they sit. I'm not sure what you reckon, Cam.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. The biochar from a soil point of view, it depends where you're starting from and what your most, if soil structure is most limiting, because as you said, the biochar is a resistant form of carbon. It's in a way that the bugs can't eat it. So you're not getting that mineralization value that I spoke about before, so that nutrient release, and you're certainly not getting then the carbon dioxide leaking out of your soil and back into the atmosphere. So it's really about those sort of structural changes in your soil. We played around with a little bit of it. I couldn't see any response on our soils, but having said that, when you looked at the sort of biological activity and the water holding capacity for that soil texture, there isn't much room to go that we know much further than what it can actually hold and what it can do. So horses for courses, right thing in the right place. We actually contemplated, we've kicked around the idea of, because we've got a couple of woodlot plantations in there, spotted gums, and we thought, well, do we trim them up and mill them, as Graeme said, or do we just turn the whole lot into biochar and just bring them home again and then replant them again? And almost like have a harvesting of those trees, just sucking the carbon dioxide out. And whether we put the biochar in a big pile in the corner of a paddock or spread it, might be much benefit, except that it's stable. And maybe that's a cycle thing that we've got to get our heads around and start to think about a bit more.
Thanks, Cam. And there's actually a question that starts to touch on that. And I think it's been sort of motivated from the fact that you kind of have spoken to how the trees hit this maturing phase where they've hit peak pile and they're coming down the other side, and their sort of annual capacity for carbon sequestration slows down. Are there ways that you're starting to think about, or even beginning to sort of enact, how you deal with that? Potentially the harvesting of mature trees for timber, or the planting of newer trees who'll be able to have that earlier growth. Ultimately, there is this challenge. You can't just keep planting up your farm, or you'll become a beautiful biodiversity hotspot. And you spoke to all those other great benefits that the trees are bringing. But, if you're looking at that carbon calc and where to go, how does that work in terms of the tree space?
It's a really good question, and we've been grappling with this because we look at some of what we consider to be big mature trees now, and you know, because if there a limb comes down in a windstorm and you've got to cut it up, you realise just how much is in it, you know, how much is actually stored in it, and you think, boy, you know, do we start this cycle again? But you know, as I said, the trees owe us nothing. So our current thinking is that no, they're staying there. The trees owe us nothing, and in fact, it's one of the most pleasurable things is driving around the farm, seeing those old mature trees and the wildlife that's associated with them. It is just, you know, but we're a bit sort of funny like that. I think if we had more land, we might think about that farm planning with a bit more of that carbon in mind. We've certainly, in the last few plantations that we've put in, up the concentration of those longer growing, bigger utes that will capture more carbon. So there has been a subtle shift in, if you like, the mix that we've put in, to have a bit more of those. And maybe if we had, you know, more bare land again and started again, we might look at something that is purely there as a carbon cycle. But so when we planted, it wasn't about that. It was really about well, first of all, I was just trying to get shade and shelter, you know.
Yeah, great. And Graeme, do you want to add anything to that in terms of just the farm benefits of having trees about? There's a lot of sort of questions in the chat here about spotted gums, but, you know, do you want to add anything to this kind of tangential benefits of getting trees out there?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you know, Cam's made some great points. That those trees are providing great shelter, and that's the beauty of good farm planning is most farmers I know that have planted trees in the right spot just sit back and, you know, they keep giving joy every time you drive past them and every time they flower and have birds nesting in them and everything too. So that's all good. But there is an opportunity there because we do, you know, as a part of our whole era of land care, there's been such amazing work done on farms that's planted so many trees with shade and shelter. And we'd certainly know in most districts you can drive through, there's still plenty of room to do that again, you know, and most farmers that have planted, you know, done farm planning and planted about, you know, 10% of their farm with trees, they're still producing more food and fibre than when they started. They've got better sheltered paddocks, they've got a more productive system, they've got more biodiversity and ecological services that's helping, you know, manage pests because you've got a more balanced environment, and it's a hell of a lot nicer to be driving around. And then when you do get some extreme weather, you know, you've got sheltered stock and sheltered lambs and everything, which all helps. And certainly there is some, you know, pest animal and some foxes and things that have to be controlled. But those farmers that do that just say, well, we can handle that. This is still a better farm by having it. I guess the bit about the commercial tree side of things is that, and as Cam said, if you've got enough room and you're doing a lot of vegetation, there's certainly farms around that have got elements where they're purposely managed as farm forestry. And, you know, they're looking at that as a portion of the land they've put into trees for timber. And those trees will grow, they'll capture carbon as they grow. When they're harvested, that, you know, that timber then gets used in construction or flooring or something. So that some of that carbon gets put into another form. So it's not automatically released. There is some released. But over 100 years, if you imagine it in that way, those farmers are saying, we're still going to keep that as treed land. We're just going to cycle, you know, every 20 years we'll do a harvest. And if you had a 20-year rotation, that could be 5 crops of carbon out of the atmosphere and into wood products. And so if the right price signals were there and farmers were getting paid a lot for their farm-grown timber, you know, then, you know, that becomes basically a form of carbon farming. And it's really interesting if you hold a bit of timber up that's been grown on a farm, you know, that's, you know, you're holding something that is quite unusual in modern society. Most products you hold in society are associated with emissions that were put into the atmosphere. Farmers can grow stuff where actually 10 years earlier, this stuff had carbon that was in the atmosphere and it's now brought back down to earth doing something useful. So I think in the coming decades, you know, there's a lot of smart farmers out there. If they can find ways that we can bring carbon down to earth and put it to good use, then, you know, well, hopefully that'll then be rewarded. But I think probably a lot of our land care farmers are just a bit ahead of the game. And as Cam said, a lot of the great work that's been done, you know, farmers can put their hand in the heart and know that they've taken a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, but a lot of it hasn't been counted for carbon credit things, but still done it for the right reasons, and they've still got good looking farms.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Something else I'll just add to that very quickly, Claire, is that we need to be mindful when we're talking about trying to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and trees in particular, that the way the models or the crediting works at the moment, the most carbon you can pull out is in our part of the world is to plant radiata pine. Okay, that will give us our greatest carbon credits per hectare. What that does from an environmental point of view and a farm planning point of view is something that you need to balance up. So if you were just chasing carbon credits, our whole farm would be pine trees. But it's not what we want, because we want a balanced system. And we're going to have a bit of a challenge, because there's a lot of big emitters around the country that need to find carbon offsets. And they're buying land, and as Graeme said, the higher the rainfall and the better the soil type, the faster those trees will grow, and they'll end up planting them into the ones that give them the most carbon, which is likely to be pine trees or something. So we've got I think, a bit of a challenge there to make sure we get that balance right between the positives from a biodiversity point of view, environmental point of view, and just chasing carbon.
And the productive point of view, which I think is ultimately, why it's so important that, farmers are starting to learn and continue this journey, because they're going to be able to make decisions that have integrity around them in terms of what happens next in this space. And there will be a driver that wants good biodiverse plantings in terms of their carbon credits, if that's where you start to go. And there's drivers that say, actually, you just need to know it for yourself. So I want to I'm conscious of time, and I want to absolutely be true to the democracy of the voting up system that we've got going in the chat here. And I just want to flick for a minute to data. And Cam, you have presented something which is, really long-term data on a farm, and, really kind of depth to what you know about your calculations. But Chantel is asking a question, and I think it's starting to speak to the fact that some people are just beginning to really understand their space and the importance of starting to pay attention here. So if you had to speak to the bare minimum data that a farmer would need to start to capture and then perhaps bring to a workshop to use for an emissions calculation kind of learning example, what would that look like?
Yeah, if we're talking livestock, Claire, or okay, so if it's livestock,
let's take livestock for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So livestock, only 3 big ticket items you've got to worry about: number of animals you've got and their sex and age, okay, and their weights over time. So if you don't know them, go to the workshop and write down what you've got today, and then take them forward. Now, as I said, weights are really important for us. We used to run stock through the yards heaps of times, but never turn the scales on, never bother. Now they just come on automatically every time they go through. So we get a weight. And this OptiWeigh is just going to change our whole world, because we'll wait for the sheep one to come out. We'll just wheel that around paddocks, and we'll get an idea of what the weights of those animals are. Those two numbers you need to get accurate, because I can tell you they will drive 80% of your final number. Don't worry if you're 100 litres out on your fuel, or what little bit of herbicide you might have used, or whether it's 1 tonne or 2 tonne of fertilizer. That's not going to matter. What's going to matter is the number of animals you've got and what their weights are over a period of time. Oh, and the third bit of that is when they start lactating. So if they calve a lamb, when that happens, start with those and find technologies and things you can do to make that data collection, and you will be 80–90% on the money.
Thanks, Cam. And Anja, I'm conscious that actually there are so many ways that people are going to be able to continue to learn, and that this is ultimately starting to just tickle people's interest in starting to do potentially some in-person events. But can you speak to the carbon farming project, and is it going to offer an opportunity for farmers to learn about the tools to manage data and to track emissions? Is that part of what is going to be part of the program? I think I'm having problems with your sound, Anja. I'm not sure if that's coming through. No. Try again. I'm going to be a bit cheeky and jump to Tani then, who is our Carbon Farming Outreach Program Coordinator. Tani, do you want to speak to some of the opportunities that may exist, particularly in that data space?
Absolutely. As I'm sure Anja was very eloquently going to say, we're offering more than 130 different training events all across the state over the next 18 months. And it's really important you give us some feedback in what you want to learn. So some of these workshops will be going through 101 and some of the content we've covered today in a lot more depth, as I'm sure Cam and Graeme have very eloquently stated. They've only just started to scratch the surface, and there's so many new and exciting things. It's such a changing space. And then some of the workshops and training activities are going to go into in-depth calculators and different calculators for different sectors. So I'd really encourage you to visit our website at landcarevictoria.com/CFOP. I've just popped the link in the chat, and have a look at some of the offerings that are available there. We're adding new events every single day, and we have a lot of really exciting stuff coming up in February and March next year. So if you don't see anything near you, I think at the moment we've just got a wine event up in the northeast. So for everyone in the rest of the state, I'd really encourage you to fill out a EOI and pop in what you're interested in and the sector you'd like to learn more about and the questions you have, and we'll pass those on to our wonderful CMA and Ag Vic partners to try and make sure that the training near you is addressing those points.
Thank you, Tani. So I guess this is a kind of acknowledgement that there are so many questions left in the chat that we didn't have time for today, but there are going to be so many more opportunities if you do have an interest in this space to come along and be part of an event. The program is funded from the Commonwealth Government of Australia, and they are through the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water under the National Carbon Farming Outreach Program. And this offering that is Victoria has particular strengths because it's bringing that expertise from Ag Victoria, it's bringing real practical examples for the region that you are based in as a farmer to play, and the CMA expertise, but also the wonder of Landcare. And, you know, Landcare has been around for almost 40 years and has got great practices that they can start to speak to around how you might begin to change practices or evolve what happens on your farm. So we're really keen to know what it is that has been really valuable about this, what it is that we can do better in terms of these webinars, because our hope is the first of a series that will hopefully build attendance over time. So make sure you visit the website. You can register for upcoming events and we'll let you know when they're coming up, or you can just check out the calendar with more and more events that are coming out every day. So we will send around a recording from the webinar today and also an evaluation and feedback. And I just want to do a huge shout out and thank you to Anja, to Cam and to Graeme for being part of this event today. It just means that people can zoom in on an evening rather than having to take time out of a busy day to attend the event as well. So we acknowledge that you coming here is something that will continue to be accessed by people over time. Were there any final comments, Cam or Graeme or Anja, that you wanted to make for the evening?
Only thing I'd say is get excited and start now. You're never going to get there unless you start.
Yeah, absolutely. Graeme, anything from you?
Yeah, no, well done. Thanks for joining, everyone. And don't try and solve it all alone. Team up with others. It's a great opportunity to link up with the events that are happening nearby you in the next year or two. And if you can't see any there, then get in touch, say what you're interested in so that you can get an event happening in your place. So thanks heaps for hosting, everyone.
No worries. And I guess I'm going to finish by just acknowledging that this is a quickly changing space, that ultimately it's going to be ongoing learning and conversations with people local to you to continue to unpick the threads of it. There are changes that are happening around the values of biodiversity and how they might be picked up and valued externally and not just by people like us in Landcare who have a strong affiliation with the beauty of old trees and amazing habitat that they create. So keep learning. Come and be part of some of our events, and thank you again for joining us tonight.